He said he loved you. But have you noticed when he said it the most? It wasn't when you were standing strong. It wasn't when you were glowing or laughing too loudly or making plans for your own life. It was when you were unsure, when your voice trembled, when you asked if he was okay, because his silence was slowly suffocating you. It was when you cried quietly and still apologized. It was when you blamed yourself for the shift in his tone, for the emotional distance, for the way he made you feel invisible, and then guilty for noticing. He said he loved you, but it wasn't love. It was control disguised as care. Thomas Erikson calls this emotional dependency engineering, the silent, almost invisible tactic, where one partner slowly conditions the other to associate attention with submission and distance with independence. It's not random. It's not just how he is. It's calculated. Maybe not in words, but in behavior, in patterns, in timing. You weren't loved for your fullness. You were rewarded for your silence. Affection came when you shrank. Attention came when you doubted yourself. He held you, but only after he made you cold. And what hurts the most? You thought that was love. You thought the way he came back after pulling away meant he cared. You thought his jealousy was passion. You thought his criticism was honesty. You thought the way he questioned your every decision was protection. But deep down you started to feel it. This wasn't love. It was something else. Something that felt like being on a leash. He didn't love the real you. He loved the version of you that didn't challenge, the one who walked on eggshells, the one who tried to stay soft, likable, pleasing, even when your soul was screaming. He loved the woman who asked for permission to exist. The problem is, you believed that was you. So you worked harder. You kept adjusting. You apologized more. You questioned yourself. You told your friends, he's just going through something. You told yourself, I'm too emotional. I need to calm down. But it wasn't you. It was the environment. It was the emotional ecosystem he carefully built, one where he only felt safe when you felt small. Because when you were unsure, he felt powerful. When you depended on his moods, his validation, his responses, he felt like a man. And the day you started to trust your own instincts, the day you didn't beg, the day you stopped explaining yourself over and over, was the day he started to pull away. Why? Because your strength wasn't what he signed up for. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a projection. He didn't want your truth. He wanted your silence. And when you started showing signs of awakening, even subtle ones, he saw the danger, not to the relationship, to his control. And that's when he changed. Not all at once, but in slow, deliberate moments. Shorter reply, less eye contact, withholding affection, punishing your independence with distance, making you feel guilty for growing. It was all meant to bring you back down, back to the version of you that made him feel big. Because that's the part no one warns you about. Some people don't love you. They love how small you feel around them. And the moment you stop feeling small, they stop feeling in control. They stop calling. They stop trying. They stop pretending. But don't mistake that for love lost. It wasn't love that left. It was control that collapsed. You didn't lose a man who cherished your soul. You lost the illusion of love that only existed as long as you kept betraying yourself. And now that you're starting to come back to yourself, even if your voice still shakes, you're dangerous. Not because you're cruel, not because you're harsh, but because you're no longer easy to manage, emotionally. And men who only feel strong next to women who feel weak, don't know what to do with someone who's slowly standing up. He didn't love you. He just loved how powerless you felt. And now that power is coming back to you, he never raised his voice. He never had to. Control doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it holds your hand and makes you feel like you're the one who's overreacting. Sometimes it tells you, I just want what's best for you, while slowly erasing everything that made you feel alive. He didn't hit you. He didn't scream. He didn't forbid you from leaving the house. Instead, he made you question yourself, until you stopped wanting to go anywhere at all. That's the kind of control no one teaches you to recognize. The kind that looks like care, sounds like love, and feels like obligation. Thomas Erikson explains that emotional manipulators often disguise control as concern. They don't dominate through force. They dominate through doubt. He asked where you were going, but not out of curiosity. He wanted to know who'd be there, what you'd wear, how long you'd be out, because the more you explained, the more you obeyed. He didn't say don't wear that. He just looked at you differently when you did. And eventually you started choosing differently, without him ever needing to ask again. He didn't ban you from dreaming bigger. He just sighed when you talked about your goals. He made you feel silly, unrealistic, like the dreamer in the room was the problem, not the cage he built around your spirit. So you stopped dreaming out loud. You made yourself smaller, quieter, more reasonable, more acceptable, more. And every time you adapted, he rewarded you with just enough warmth to confuse you, just enough approval to keep you reaching. It was never about who you were. It was about how much you'd shrink to stay. Because the more you shrank, the more control he had. And isn't that what it was always about? Not love, not partnership, not two souls evolving together. It was about dominance, about keeping you dependent, emotionally tired, energetically unsure, afraid of doing anything that might disturb his comfort. And the most painful part, you thought that discomfort was your fault. You internalized his moods. You walked on eggshells. You replayed conversations in your head, wondering what you said wrong. You asked less. You needed less. You expected less. Because you thought that's what being easier to love looked like. But what he really wanted was for you to surrender yourself, piece by piece, until you were someone he could fully mold. And when you stopped doing that, when you started remembering who you were before him, when you started reclaiming your own voice, your own schedule, your own joy, he didn't say he was proud. He said you were changing. He said you're not the same anymore, as if that was a betrayal. But it wasn't betrayal. It was rebirth. You started breaking the rules of a relationship you didn't even know you'd agreed to. Rules like, don't outshine him, don't challenge him, don't grow faster than he's comfortable with, don't ask for more than he's willing to give. And once you started breaking those rules, you became difficult, moody, too much. But what you really became was free, and he couldn't handle that. Because freedom doesn't make you easier to love. It makes you harder to control. He never loved your freedom. He loved your compliance. He loved the ease of keeping you off balance. He loved the version of you that apologized for taking up space. But that version is fading, and in her place, a woman is rising, slowly, steadily, unapologetically. And she is not here to be managed. She is not here to be tamed. She is here to remember what love actually is, and what it never should have been. When he started reaching out again, you thought maybe he had changed. Maybe he realized what he lost. Maybe he missed you. Maybe finally, he saw your worth. He said he missed your voice, your softness, your way of making everything feel like home. But listen carefully. He didn't miss you. He missed the power he felt when you kept trying. Because now that you've started pulling away, now that you stopped over-explaining, now that your silence no longer comes with desperation, he's losing something. Not love, control. He misses being the one who could tilt your entire mood with a look. He misses the version of you who waited by the phone, who answered on the first ring, who stayed up late just to decode a message he wrote, without emotion. He misses your availability, your anxiety, your fear of disappointing him. Not your soul, not your truth, not your spirit, just your submission. Thomas Erikson defines this as the reversal of need perception. When the manipulator starts to experience withdrawal, not because they lost intimacy, but because they lost their emotional advantage. He doesn't miss you. He misses what you gave him. Reassurance without accountability, loyalty without reciprocity, presence without effort. And now that you've stopped bleeding for his comfort, he's uncomfortable. So he comes back, with the same charm, the same subtle softness, the same words he knows worked before. I've been thinking about you. No one gets me like you do. We had something real. But when you look closer, really look, you'll notice he never actually apologizes. He never owns the manipulation. He never says I took advantage of your love. He just says he misses how things were, which is code for I miss the version of you that accepted less than she deserved. And now that version of you is gone. She's still healing, still doubting, still tempted sometimes, but she's waking up. And when she hears his voice, she doesn't melt. She listens, and she remembers. She remembers the waiting, the confusion, the anxiety, the nights replaying every conversation, wondering what she did wrong, not realizing the answer was, she loved someone who only felt powerful when she felt small. Now the roles are reversing. Now you hold the clarity. Now he's the one wondering if he said too much or too little. But that doesn't mean he sees your worth. It just means he lost access to the version of you who doubted hers. And that access, you don't owe it to anyone, especially not to the one who trained you to fear your own strength. You may still feel the pull, that ache to return, to rescue, but ask yourself, did he ever feel that same ache when it was you who was breaking? Or did he look the other way, wait for you to blame yourself, then welcome you back, only when you were fragile enough to need him? That's not love, that's possession. And what he's calling missing you is really just missing that power. But now you know, now you see, and that knowing is the beginning of freedom. He didn't miss you, he missed the version of you who didn't know the difference. And now you do. There's a terrifying moment in every manipulative relationship, but not for you, for him. It's the moment he realizes, you're no longer afraid to walk away. That's what he's always counted on. Not your love, not your kindness, not your loyalty, your fear of being alone, your fear of starting over, your fear of being the one who gives up, your fear of not being enough, and trying harder just to be tolerated. Thomas Erikson calls it fear dependency programming, when someone feeds your fear just enough to keep you close, but never enough to make you feel safe. He never needed to lock you in, he just made sure you never felt strong enough to leave. So when you started pulling away, not with anger, but with awareness, he panicked, not because he thought he was losing something sacred, but because you were finally seeing through him. You stopped reacting to his passive-aggressive silence. You stopped defending yourself for things he twisted. You stopped waiting for his moods to dictate your day. You started waking up without needing his validation to feel okay. And that was the moment the power shifted. Because he was never afraid of losing you. He was afraid of you realizing that you didn't need him to survive, that you could walk away, heal, breathe, feel lonely, and not run back, feel pain and not make it his responsibility to fix. He was afraid of the moment you'd stop playing the role he wrote for you, the one where he's the storm and you're the shelter, the one where he breaks you down, and you thank him for staying, the one where he disappears, and you take the blame. But that role no longer fit, because you're no longer playing small. You're no longer apologizing for asking for the bare minimum. You're no longer shrinking yourself to avoid being too much. You started to understand that being loved isn't supposed to feel like guessing. It isn't supposed to feel like keeping someone happy just to feel safe. It isn't supposed to feel like silence you have to decode. You started remembering that love, actual love, isn't afraid of your voice, your power, your healing. It celebrates it, and he never did. He tolerated you when you were broken. He stayed close when you were lost. He leaned in when you were afraid, not because he loved you, but because your fear made him feel big. But now, you don't worship his silence. You don't chase his approval. You don't fear his absence, like you used to. And that's the loss he never planned for. You see, he built the whole relationship on one assumption, that you needed him more than he needed you, that as long as he stayed just out of reach, you'd keep reaching, that as long as he gave you just enough, you'd stay hungry. But something shifted, not all at once, not loudly, quietly, painfully, powerfully. You stopped reaching, you stopped asking, you stopped accepting love, with terms and conditions. And in that stillness, you realized, you were never asking for too much, you were just asking the wrong person. So now he watches, he waits, he says you've changed, he says you used to care more, he says you've become cold. But what he really means is, I can't control you anymore. He was never afraid of losing you. He was afraid of you remembering who you were before he convinced you to forget. And now you're becoming her again. And that is something he cannot stop. He didn't ask you to be silent, but he rewarded you every time you said less, every time you didn't push back, every time you laughed off something that hurt, every time you swallowed your truth to preserve his comfort. He never told you to dim your light, but every time you shined too brightly, he pulled away, with a colder tone, with an eye roll, with distance you couldn't name, but you felt it. And over time, you learned, not with words, but with emotional conditioning. You learned which parts of yourself to silence. You learned which dreams were too much. You learned which needs made you feel like a burden. You learned to stay in the lines of his comfort zone, even when that meant leaving yourself outside of it. Because when you made yourself small, when you needed less, he praised you. When you stopped asking, he called you chill. And when you didn't speak up, he said I love how easy you are. But easy was never who you were. It was who you became to keep him around. Thomas Erikson calls this the survival identity, a false version of yourself, created not to thrive, but to avoid being abandoned. And you wore that version so well, even you started to believe she was real. The low-maintenance version, the always understanding version, the one who never asked for too much, the one who always gave him the benefit of the doubt, even when the doubt was screaming, even when your body told you to run. But he liked you that way, quiet, confused, grateful for the bare minimum. Because the less you asked, the less he had to give. The more you doubted yourself, the less he had to change. The more you stayed soft, the more he got away with being sharp. And every time you considered leaving, he gave you just enough attention, just enough warmth, just enough maybe this time, to reset the cycle. He was never interested in meeting your needs. He was only interested in you forgetting you had them. Because a woman who's unsure of her own voice is easier to manage, easier to mold, easier to hold hostage, without ever raising a hand. So he made you feel like every emotional reaction was too sensitive, every request was too needy, every boundary was too dramatic. And over time, you stopped reacting, you stopped requesting, you stopped setting boundaries, you stopped being you. And still, it wasn't enough. Because control doesn't stop when you surrender. It escalates, it devours, it rewrites the rules, until you can't even remember who you were before you bent so far. But something happened, something small, something sacred. You began to feel again, you began to notice what you'd been missing. Your own voice, your own needs, your own self. And that voice, even shaky, even scared, was enough to threaten everything he built. Because he didn't fall in love with your power, he fell in love with your compliance. And now that compliance is unraveling. Not because you want revenge, not because you want to prove anything, because you're tired of whispering your needs into silence, tired of thanking someone for treating you like you're disposable, tired of calling manipulation love, and calling your own intuition crazy. You're tired, and you're done, because the real you, she was never too much, she was never too intense, she was never the problem, she was just inconvenient, for someone who only loved you when you forgot how to love yourself. He never said it out loud, but the rules were always clear. Love him, forgive him, put him first, and don't outgrow him. He expected loyalty, not partnership, devotion, not equality, obedience masked as love. And the moment you started thinking for yourself, feeling for yourself, deciding for yourself, he labeled it rebellion. You weren't loving anymore. You were selfish, cold, unrecognizable, not because you betrayed him, but because you stopped betraying yourself. Thomas Erikson describes this as emotional containment. When someone builds a relationship that thrives on your emotional confinement and calls it commitment, he didn't want your freedom, he wanted your fixation. He didn't care if you were happy, as long as you stayed close. He didn't care if you were whole, as long as you didn't stop needing him to feel complete. Your strength was not a threat to the relationship, it was a threat to his control. Because the truth is, he was never afraid of losing you. He was afraid of you realizing you were allowed to leave, that you were allowed to say no, that you were allowed to exist fully, even if it made him uncomfortable. You were allowed to have boundaries, to outgrow dynamics that used to feel like home, but had become cages, to question things that once made you feel crazy for noticing. But he didn't love your awareness. He needed your confusion. He didn't love your presence. He needed your dependence. And when those started to fade, he panicked, not with honesty, but with manipulation. Suddenly he missed you. Suddenly he wanted to talk. Suddenly he remembered how good it used to be. But nostalgia is a weapon in the hands of those who never intended to change. He romanticized the version of you that tolerated being minimized. He longed for the days when your worth was measured by your silence. He didn't want a partner who challenged him. He wanted a mirror that reflected exactly what he wanted to see. And when you cracked that mirror, when you started showing emotion, he couldn't control, truth he couldn't silence, light he couldn't dim. He called it drama, but the drama was never yours. It was his reaction to losing the version of you who made his life easier, at the cost of your own peace. You were loyal, but loyalty isn't love if it requires self-abandonment. You were committed, but commitment is a prison when the terms are written by only one person. You stayed longer than you should have. You bent more than you knew. You carried a weight that was never yours to hold. And still, it wasn't enough, because what he wanted wasn't love, it was ownership. And love cannot live where ownership resides. You're not ungrateful for walking away. You're not heartless for choosing yourself. You're not cold for protecting your healing. You're reclaiming something sacred. The right to be free. The right to be whole. The right to be loved without being controlled. He didn't want your liberation. He wanted your loyalty, at the cost of your soul. But now you belong to yourself again. And that is something he will never be able to hold. He never laid a hand on you. He didn't need to. Because the damage wasn't loud. It was quiet, polite, almost invisible. He made you second-guess your instincts. He taught you to apologize for your emotions. He convinced you that your needs were too much. Your boundaries were selfish. Your reactions were overblown. He didn't break you directly. He trained you to question yourself so deeply
that eventually, you started breaking from the inside out. Thomas Erikson defines this as internalized manipulation, when the person no longer has to control you, because you've learned to control yourself to fit their expectations. You started silencing your own voice, filtering your own feelings, editing your own truths, just to keep the peace. You told yourself you were being mature, empathetic, understanding, but what you were really doing was disappearing, piece by piece, until one day, you couldn't recognize the reflection anymore. You looked in the mirror and saw someone tired, someone quiet, someone who looked like they were always walking on emotional eggshells, never knowing what version of him would show up next. That wasn't love, that was programming, and it worked. You stopped expecting affection, you stopped expressing hurt, you stopped hoping for consistency. You learned to celebrate crumbs, to romanticize mixed signals, to confuse exhaustion with intimacy. But now, you're waking up, and it's disorienting, because part of you still wants to believe it was real, that it meant something, that the way he said I love you, even if only when you were on your knees, had truth behind it. But it didn't, not the kind of truth your soul deserves, because real love doesn't need you to shrink. It doesn't punish your voice, it doesn't withhold affection until you collapse. Real love doesn't teach you to abandon yourself, just to keep someone else close. And you've learned that now, the hard way, the quiet way, the brave way. You've learned that being too emotional was just code for, I can't manipulate you when you feel deeply. You've learned that being too sensitive was his way of deflecting accountability, that your pain wasn't the problem, his lack of empathy was. And now, every time you feel the urge to apologize for your own existence, you pause, you breathe, you remember he didn't break you, he just made you forget how whole you already were. But now you remember, now you feel, now you see. You've stopped trying to earn love by bleeding for it. You've stopped chasing closure from someone who was never open. You've stopped negotiating your worth in spaces that only valued your silence. You don't need him to break you again, because you've already rebuilt what he couldn't touch. Your intuition, your clarity, your voice, your power. He didn't love you. He loved the control he felt when you doubted yourself. But that version of you is gone now, and in her place stands a woman who knows she was never too much. She was simply too awake to stay asleep for someone else's comfort. You didn't break, you were reborn, and no one owns you now. You weren't too sensitive, you were just in a place that punished sensitivity, because it couldn't handle truth. If this story felt like yours, even in pieces, leave a comment. I'm done breaking myself to be loved. And remember, the strongest part of you is the one they tried hardest to silence.